Every history class teaches you the exact same timeline of human progress. It is clean, simple, and presented as absolute fact. First, you have the glory of the Roman Empire. Then, Rome falls, and the lights of human civilization go out. Humanity plunges into 800 years of misery, ignorance, and plague. We call it the Dark Ages. Finally, Europe wakes up, rediscovers science during the Renaissance, and saves the world. It is a beautiful story of Western redemption. It is also a massive, Eurocentric fabrication. The Dark Ages never happened to humanity. They only happened to a tiny, freezing peninsula called Western Europe. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the Dark Ages lie and the 800-year blind spot in your textbook. If you are the kind of person who questions what you have been taught, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. To understand the scale of this historical illusion, we need to look at what you were actually taught. The year is 476. The last Roman emperor is deposed. The empire officially collapses. According to the standard textbook narrative, this is the exact moment human progress hits a solid brick wall. The official story paints a terrifying picture of the centuries that followed. Without the protection and engineering of Rome, Europe descended into absolute chaos. People forgot how to read. They forgot how to build aqueducts. They forgot how to make concrete. Imagine living in the shadow of massive Roman ruins. You were looking up at the Colosseum or the Pantheon, knowing your own generation could never build anything like it. You were living in a mud hut next to a broken marble column. It must have felt like the end of the world. And for the people living in Western Europe, it absolutely was. Kings were completely illiterate. Medicine was reduced to superstition and bloodletting. The average person rarely traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. The official story tells us that human knowledge was barely kept alive by a few isolated monks. They sat in freezing stone monasteries, copying old Latin Bibles by candlelight, waiting for the darkness to pass. This is the version of history the West wrote for itself. It frames the fall of Rome as a global tragedy. It equates the collapse of one European empire with the collapse of human civilization itself. But that is just the surface, because the buried record goes deeper. What happens if you take that map of Europe and simply zoom out? If you look past the borders of the old Roman Empire, a completely different reality emerges. The world did not go dark. In fact, it was burning brighter than it ever had before. While kings in France and England were struggling to defend muddy, wooden villages, the rest of the planet was entering a massive golden age. Let's look halfway across the world. While Europe was supposedly in the depths of the Dark Ages, the Tang and Song dynasties in China were building the most advanced civilization on Earth. Think about London or Paris in the 9th century. They were little more than glorified medieval campsites. Their populations were maybe a few thousand people, living in squalor. Now look at Chang'an, the capital of the Tang dynasty. It had a population of over 1 million people. It was a massive, perfectly gridded metropolis. The Chinese were not forgetting how to read. They were inventing woodblock printing to mass-produce books. They were not losing their economy. They were inventing the concept of paper money to handle the sheer volume of their global trade. They possessed mechanical clocks. They invented gunpowder. They mapped the stars with highly precise astronomical instruments. They even required their government officials to pass rigorous, highly competitive written exams. They had to prove their intellectual merit to serve the state. Meanwhile, European kings were signing official state documents with a simple X, because they literally did not know the alphabet. But you do not even have to look as far as China to see the lie. You just have to look at the southern edge of Europe itself. While northern Europe was stumbling through the mud, the Islamic Empire had expanded into the Iberian Peninsula. They built the city of Cordoba in modern-day Spain, and Cordoba was an absolute masterpiece of human engineering. If you walked through Cordoba in the 10th century, you would not be walking in mud. You would be walking on perfectly paved streets, and at night, those streets were illuminated by public street lamps. That is a basic civic luxury that London and Paris would not figure out for another 700 years. Cordoba had running water. It possessed hundreds of public baths, highly advanced hospitals, and sprawling libraries. The largest library in Cordoba contained over 400,000 books. At that exact same time, the largest Christian library in all of Europe contained maybe 400 books. The contrast is absolutely staggering. You have to ask yourself a serious, uncomfortable question. How can an entire era of human history be universally labeled dark when a city in Spain has streetlights and an empire in China is printing paper money? The answer is simple. The victors write the history, but the survivors write the curriculum. The West took their own localized, regional disaster and projected it onto the entire planet. They assumed that if they were suffering, everyone else must be suffering too. But the Eastern record tells a completely different story. The true epicenter of human progress during this time wasn't in Europe, and it wasn't even in Spain. It was further east, in the Middle East. And what scholars were doing there would eventually be stolen, rebranded, and used to completely rewrite the modern Western world. The year is 830. Baghdad is the undisputed capital of the world. It sits perfectly at the crossroads of the global economy, and the Abbasid caliphs who rule the city make a completely unprecedented decision. They do not just build a massive army, they build an intellectual empire. They construct a massive, sprawling academic center called the House of Wisdom. It becomes the ultimate magnet for human intelligence. The official Western narrative claims that during this time, ancient Greek philosophy was simply lost. The brilliant works of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates just vanished into the European mud. But the Eastern record shows they were not lost at all. They were just packed up and moved. Scholars in Baghdad launched a massive state-sponsored translation movement. The caliph literally paid translators their own weight in pure gold for every single book they could translate into Arabic. It did not matter if the scholar was Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or Hindu. If you had knowledge, Baghdad was writing the checks. They gathered ancient Greek texts. They imported complex mathematics from India. They brought in engineering manuals from China. They gathered the entire collective memory of the human race and placed it in a single city. But here is what no Western historian will tell you. The standard textbook tries to minimize this. It claims the Islamic Empire simply acted as a massive library. They say the Arabs just babysat classical knowledge until Europe was finally ready to ask for it back. That is a massive historical insult. The scholars in the House of Wisdom did not just preserve Greek science. They completely dismantled it. They tested it. They found massive errors in it. And then they vastly improved upon it. While a European monk was struggling to copy a Latin Bible by candlelight, an Eastern mathematician named Al-Khwarizmi was writing a book. That book systematically outlined a revolutionary new way to solve complex equations. Today, we call that system algebra. The very word comes from the title of his Arabic text, Al-Jabr. Every single time you type a number into your phone, you are using Arabic numerals. The concept of the number 0 was imported from India, refined in Baghdad, and turned into the foundation of all modern mathematics. Without the scholars of the Dark Ages, modern engineering simply does not exist. But the buried record goes much deeper than math. Look at the state of medicine. If you got sick in 9th century London, the local priest would likely tell you it was a demonic punishment. The standard medical treatment was cutting your arm and draining your blood until you passed out. Meanwhile, in the Islamic Golden Age, medicine was a highly advanced, heavily regulated science. They built massive public hospitals with separate wards for different diseases. They understood the concept of airborne contagion. They required doctors to pass rigorous licensing exams before they were allowed to touch a patient. A surgeon named Al-Zahrawi wrote a 30-volume medical encyclopedia. He invented over 200 surgical instruments. Many of those exact designs are still sitting on the trays of modern operating rooms right now. They were performing highly complex, incredibly delicate cataract surgeries to restore human vision. They used hollow needles to carefully extract cataracts from the eye. Think about that contrast. Europe was bleeding people to death to cure a fever. The East was performing successful eye surgery. How can anyone call this era dark? They were mapping the precise movements of the stars. They perfected the astrolabe, a highly complex analog computer used for celestial navigation. They figured out exactly how light enters the human eye, essentially laying the absolute foundation for modern optics and the camera. The light of human progress was not flickering. It was a blinding spotlight. But Europe was completely isolated from it. They were trapped behind their own borders, paralyzed by religious dogma and constant, brutal, feudal warfare. But that was just the surface, because the timeline is about to shift. And this is where the story most people know stops being true. For centuries, the East and the West existed in two completely different realities. One was a thriving, highly connected global intellectual network. The other was a freezing, isolated peninsula. And then, the isolated barbarians of Europe finally left their peninsula. In 1095, the Pope launched the First Crusade. Hundreds of thousands of European knights and peasants marched toward the Middle East. They were fueled by absolute religious zeal, but they were also fueled by a massive superiority complex. They firmly believed they were the chosen people, marching into a primitive wasteland. When they finally arrived in the Levant, they were completely humiliated. The Crusaders did not encounter backwards barbarians. They encountered a civilization that was centuries ahead of them in almost every conceivable metric. The Eastern armies wore highly advanced steel armor that European blacksmiths could not even comprehend. They fought with Damascus steel swords that could slice through European iron like butter. But the biggest shock was not the military technology. It was the lifestyle. The Crusaders walked into cities and found public baths with hot and cold running water. They tasted sugar for the very first time. They discovered complex spices, woven silk, and advanced medicines. They realized with absolute horror that they were the uncultured barbarians. This collision was brutal, bloody, and devastating, but it triggered a massive, unavoidable transfer of knowledge. When the Crusaders eventually returned to Europe, they didn't just bring back stolen gold. They brought back Arabic books. They brought back the astrolabe. They brought back the concept of the hospital. They brought back algebra, advanced geometry, and accurate maps of the world. The absolute bedrock of the modern Western world was physically carried back in the saddlebags of exhausted European knights. Fast forward a few hundred years. The translated Arabic texts slowly begin to circulate through European monasteries and early universities. European scholars suddenly have access to the upgraded, highly perfected science of the Greeks, the Indians, and the Islamic Golden Age. And this is where the ultimate historical theft takes place. The West takes this massive injection of Eastern knowledge. They use it to finally pull themselves out of the mud. They use it to build better ships. They use it to navigate the oceans. They use it to engineer massive cathedrals. And then, they give themselves all the credit. Textbooks call the 14th and 15th centuries the Renaissance. The word translates directly to rebirth. You are taught that brilliant European men suddenly woke up, shook off the mud of the Middle Ages, and single-handedly rediscovered classical science. It is framed as a uniquely Western miracle. But the buried record reveals the ultimate perception overturn. They didn't magically rediscover anything. They just finally started reading the Arabic textbooks that had been circulating in the East for half a millennium. When the first great European universities were founded in places like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna, what do you think they were actually studying? They weren't reading lost Latin scrolls pulled from the rubble of Rome. They were actively translating the massive, highly advanced encyclopedias of scholars from Baghdad and Cordoba. Look at Nicolaus Copernicus. Western history worships him for proving that the Earth revolves around the sun. It was a massive scientific breakthrough that shattered medieval dogma. But the highly complex mathematical models Copernicus used to prove his theory, the buried record shows they were completely identical to the geometric models developed by an Islamic astronomer named Al-Tusi. And Al-Tusi published his work at the Maragay Observatory 300 years before Copernicus was even born. The medical textbooks used to train European doctors well into the 17th century were not written by Englishmen or Frenchmen. They were written by a Persian polymath named Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. His canon of medicine was the absolute global standard. Europe was just catching up to what the East already knew. This is the reality of the Renaissance. It was not a magical, isolated European rebirth. It was a massive transfer of intellectual wealth from East to West. For 800 years, Europe was not the savior of human civilization. They were the isolated, illiterate fringe. The East was the glowing, undisputed center of the world. The Chinese were printing books and navigating with magnetic compasses. The Islamic Empire was mapping the stars and performing complex surgery. So why does the lie persist? Why do we still use the term Dark Ages in modern classrooms? Because whoever controls the timeline controls the narrative. When you call an entire era of human history dark simply because London and Paris were struggling, you are making a massive, arrogant claim. You are centering the entire human story on a single, freezing European peninsula. You are actively erasing the golden ages of China, India, and the Middle East. You are reducing the majority of the globe to a silent, irrelevant backdrop. The Dark Ages is not a historical era. It is a psychological blind spot. It is a brilliant piece of branding. It was designed to make the eventual rise of the modern West look like the inevitable return of the rightful kings. But history isn't dark or light. It depends entirely on where you are standing. The European experience is not the universal human experience. Next time someone tells you the lights of human progress went out when the Roman Empire collapsed, remember the buried record. The lights were actually burning brighter than they ever had before. The world was advancing. Science was thriving. The West just had their eyes closed. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the historical record. The Arabic texts, the Chinese inventions, the exact path of the translated books. It is all there. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this changed how you see the Dark Ages, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe,